A man is dead. The cameras were turned off. The lights were cut. And the government says, trust us. In less than 1 minute, a quiet home became a crime scene, a citizen became a statistic, and accountability disappeared into policy language. This is not just a raid gone wrong. This is a test of whether power still answers to the people it serves. A man was dead in 57 seconds. Not after a chase, not after a standoff, not after hours of negotiation. 57 seconds from the moment a doorbell camera was deliberately covered until a gunshot ended a life inside a private home. No arrest warrant, only a search warrant, executed before sunrise, in darkness, without body cameras recording what happened. That is where Jim Jordan began, not with outrage, not with theatrics, but with a fact pattern so stark it did not need embellishment. A citizen named Bryan Malinowski was alive when federal agents approached his house in the early morning hours of March 19th. Less than a minute later, he was fatally wounded on his own floor. Between those two moments, the objective record vanished, and the government, sitting under oath, was asking to be trusted anyway. Steven Dettelbach sat upright at the witness table, composed, measured, speaking with the calm cadence of an official accustomed to congressional scrutiny. He did not dispute the timeline. He did not dispute the outcome. Instead, he reached immediately for procedure, policy, and process. An independent investigation, Department of Justice guidelines, long-standing rules about not commenting on pending matters. Jordan did not challenge the existence of policy. He did not argue about jurisdiction. He did not accuse anyone of murder. He narrowed the lens until it could no longer be escaped. Why was the camera covered? The question landed softly, but it landed clean. A piece of tape placed over a doorbell lens is not an abstraction. It is not a theory. It is a physical act, performed by a human hand, for a reason. Dettelbach replied that he could not discuss specifics while an investigation was ongoing. Jordan nodded once, as if acknowledging the answer, and moved on without missing a beat. Why was the electricity cut? Why was a home that was normally lit plunged into darkness at the exact moment agents entered? Why were shadows allowed to replace visibility in a dynamic, high-risk operation? Dettelbach answered the same way, invoking fairness, independence, and restraint. The room began to change, subtly at first, not with raised voices, but with stillness. People in the gallery shifted in their seats. A few phones came out, screens glowing low, recording quietly. This was no longer a routine oversight hearing. Jordan pressed forward, his tone steady, almost conversational. Why were body cameras not activated? In a pre-dawn raid conducted by a federal agency, was there no contemporaneous video record of commands given, warnings issued, or movements made? Dettelbach spoke of phased implementation, of funding constraints, of rollout schedules. He spoke as if the absence of footage were an administrative inconvenience rather than a fatal void. Jordan reminded the room that this was not an arrest operation. There was no allegation that Malinowski was attempting to flee that morning. There was no indication he posed an imminent threat requiring immediate forced entry. Agents had gathered a week earlier in a Walmart parking lot to execute the same warrant and stood down when they realized Malinowski was not home. Time existed. Options existed. Daylight existed. That fact hung in the air longer than Jordan allowed it to. He returned again to the same 3 points, stripping them of rhetoric until only their weight remained. The camera was covered. The power was cut. The body cameras were off. 3 deliberate conditions, all pointing in the same direction. Dettelbach said again that the agency was not trying to hide anything. Calling for an independent investigation, he argued, demonstrated transparency, not concealment. Jordan did not interrupt. He did not scoff. He simply allowed the words to finish echoing before asking the same question again, more slowly this time. If nothing was being hidden, why remove every mechanism that would have shown the truth? There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. It was the kind of pause that does not exist in transcripts, but lives in rooms. Dettelbach inhaled, adjusted his phrasing, and returned to policy language. Long-standing Department of Justice practice, protection of investigative integrity, fairness to all parties involved. Jordan leaned slightly forward, not aggressively but with intent. He spoke about time, not motive. 57 seconds. That was the full duration between the tape going over the lens and the fatal shot. In that window, there was no video, no audio record, no body camera footage to confirm warnings, commands, or compliance. In that absence, Jordan noted, the public was being asked to rely solely on official accounts. Accounts filtered through legal counsel. Accounts shaped by institutional interest. Accounts shielded from immediate scrutiny by policy choice rather than necessity. In any other context involving lethal force, that would be unacceptable. Jordan did not raise his voice when he mentioned standards. He described them the way a prosecutor describes elements of a crime, methodically, without flourish. When local police officers use deadly force, body camera footage is demanded. When video exists, it is analyzed frame by frame, publicly, relentlessly. Transparency is treated as a prerequisite for legitimacy. Here, transparency was preemptively removed. Dettelbach attempted to separate federal practice from local expectations. He explained differences in authority, differences in implementation timelines, differences in operational discretion. But the distinctions sounded thinner with each repetition. The room no longer reacted. It listened. Jordan asked whether a democracy could function when lethal force by the state occurred in darkness by design. He did not assert that wrongdoing had occurred. He asked whether the system being defended could ever prove its own innocence without evidence. He asked whether accountability could survive if it depended on trust alone. He waited after each question, allowing silence to do what argument could not. By the end of the exchange, nothing new had been revealed factually. No confession was made. No rule violation was admitted. And yet, the terrain had shifted. The issue was no longer the specifics of one raid, but the architecture of power that allowed the record to disappear before questions could be asked. As the first phase of the hearing moved on, the unanswered question remained suspended, unresolved, and unavoidable. Why would a government confident in its actions choose darkness over documentation? Why would it disable the very tools that exist to protect both citizens and agents alike? Why should the public accept reassurances in place of evidence? And if no answer could be given, what that silence itself was saying? The second phase of the questioning did not begin with accusation, but with memory. Jordan reached backward in time, not to reopen wounds, but to establish context the agency had hoped would remain peripheral. 1 week before March 19th, federal agents assembled in a Walmart parking lot near Malinowski's home. They were prepared to execute the same search warrant with the same personnel under the same authority. And then they stood down, because Malinowski was not there. That detail mattered more than it first appeared. It meant the government had time. It meant the operation was not driven by immediacy or danger. It meant there was no ticking clock, no hostage situation, no threat requiring force before dawn. It meant the decision to return a week later, before sunrise, was a choice rather than a necessity. Jordan let that sit, then pressed gently but deliberately. If agents could walk away once, why not wait again? If surveillance existed to confirm absence, why not use that same patience to ensure presence under safer conditions? If the objective was evidence, not arrest, why choose darkness over daylight? Each question tightened the frame, narrowing the range of acceptable answers. Dettelbach shifted slightly in his chair. He spoke about operational judgment. He spoke about discretion delegated to field agents. He spoke about safety assessments that could not be publicly disclosed. But none of it addressed the underlying point that the operation had already proven it could be postponed. The audience sensed the change before it was audible. This was no longer about a single moment gone wrong. It was about planning. It was about intent. It was about why a government with time chose speed, and why a government without urgency chose shock. Jordan moved from the parking lot to the calendar. March 19th was not an arbitrary date. It was selected. It was approved. It was signed off by supervisors who knew the warrant did not require immediate execution. Nothing about that morning was spontaneous. Dettelbach returned to structure. He emphasized layers of review. He emphasized compliance with internal guidelines. He emphasized the separation between policy and outcome. But Jordan was no longer asking about compliance. He was asking about judgment. Judgment, Jordan explained, is revealed by choices made when alternatives exist. Agents had alternatives. Supervisors had alternatives. The agency had alternatives. And yet the chosen path led to a forced entry in darkness, into a home where a man was sleeping. Jordan then brought the conversation back to record-keeping. He did not accuse anyone of deleting evidence. He did not suggest reports were falsified. He simply noted that the record was never created, and that absence was itself the result of decisions made long before the door was breached. Dettelbach said again that the investigation would answer these questions. Jordan responded by pointing out that investigations answer questions only if evidence exists. Body cameras answer questions. Uncovered doorbell footage answers questions. Electrical logs answer questions. When all of those are removed, an investigation becomes an exercise in recollection. The room grew quieter as Jordan articulated the consequence. When the state uses force without creating a record, it does not merely defend itself from scrutiny. It transfers the burden of proof to the public. Citizens are asked to create official narratives without the tools to verify them. That inversion, Jordan implied, was incompatible with democratic accountability. Dettelbach attempted to reframe. He spoke about protecting the integrity of the process. He spoke about avoiding prejudgment. He spoke about fairness to agents who could not defend themselves publicly. But the words felt increasingly abstract against the specificity of what had occurred. Jordan returned again to timing. The agents arrived more than an hour before sunrise. They chose a moment when visibility would be lowest. They chose a moment when a startled homeowner would have the least information. They chose a moment when confusion would be maximized. That choice, Jordan suggested, carried predictable risks. A loud crash at the front door. A darkened entryway. Unidentified figures moving inside a home. Those conditions did not reduce danger. They amplified it. And every law enforcement professional in the room knew it. Dettelbach hesitated before answering. He spoke about tactical considerations. He spoke about officer safety. He spoke about training. But his cadence slowed, and his phrasing became careful. He was no longer reciting policy. He was selecting words. Jordan seized on that shift without acknowledging it. He reminded the committee that Malinowski did not fire at agents as they approached. He did not confront anyone outside. He responded only after his door was breached, his home darkened, his sense of threat fully engaged. That sequence mattered. Jordan did not say Malinowski was justified. He did not say agents were unjustified. He said the conditions made tragedy foreseeable, and foreseeability, in both law and ethics, carries responsibility. Responsibility that cannot be deferred indefinitely. Dettelbach returned to the shield of the investigation. Jordan responded with the reality of public trust. Investigations take time. Trust erodes faster. When citizens see lethal force followed by silence, they fill the gap themselves. Jordan spoke now not just as a committee chair, but as a representative. He described emails received by his office, messages from constituents asking why there was no footage, asking why the lights were out, asking why no one seemed willing to answer basic questions. He did not read them aloud, but their presence was felt. Dettelbach listened, hands clasped. He nodded occasionally. He expressed understanding. He reiterated commitment to transparency at the appropriate time. But the phrase appropriate time began to sound like an exit ramp rather than a promise. Jordan closed this phase of questioning by drawing a line. The issue was no longer whether policies existed. The issue was whether those policies served the public or insulated the institution, whether procedures were tools for justice or barriers to accountability, and whether the government could expect trust while systematically disabling verification. As the exchange paused, the silence that followed was heavier than before. The facts had not changed. The outcome had not changed. But the frame had shifted irrevocably. This was no longer about what happened in one house, but about how power chooses to act when no one is watching. The third phase did not begin with theory or policy, but with time measured down to the second. Jordan asked the clerk to mark the record with a simple sequence, not an interpretation, not a conclusion. 6:01 a.m., agents arrive. 6:02 a.m., the camera is covered. Less than a minute later, gunfire erupts, and Bryan Malinowski is dying on the floor. Jordan slowed his cadence deliberately, as if forcing everyone in the room to experience the same compression of time. 57 seconds is not a long exchange. It is not a prolonged confrontation. It is barely enough time to orient yourself in the dark, to understand what is happening, to decide whether the figures in your hallway are police or intruders. It is, however, more than enough time for irreversible consequences. The sequence unfolded like a legal reconstruction played in reverse. First, the tape placed over the lens, eliminating the exterior record. Then the electricity cut, eliminating interior visibility. Then the forced entry, violent and loud, without a visual or audio trail preserved by the agents themselves. And finally, the gunshot, the only moment that mattered most, occurring in complete evidentiary darkness. Jordan did not dramatize the moment. He did not raise his voice when he described it. He spoke as if reading from a transcript that did not exist, emphasizing the absence rather than inventing detail. No footage of commands being issued. No footage of identification being announced. No footage of warnings or pauses or attempts to de-escalate. Dettelbach listened, expression controlled, eyes forward. When asked to explain the sequence, he returned to the same refrain. The investigation would determine facts. The investigation would establish accountability. The investigation would answer questions once complete. Until then, silence was framed as responsibility. Jordan did not challenge the need for investigation. He challenged the premise that investigation could substitute for documentation. An investigation reconstructs events after the fact. Video records events as they happen. One relies on memory, the other on reality. When the latter is removed by design, the former is compromised by default. Jordan introduced the human element without embellishment. Malinowski was asleep. He was not barricaded. He was not fleeing. He was not outside with a weapon. He was inside his own home when a violent entry shattered the quiet. Jordan described the wife's account without theatrical emphasis, allowing the facts to carry their own weight. A loud crash. Darkness where there should have been light. Shadowed figures moving through the entryway. A warning to stay behind. Followed by instinct overcoming instruction. Seconds collapsing into chaos. The room felt smaller as those details settled. This was no longer an abstract debate about policy compliance. It was a question of human perception under stress. What a person sees in darkness. What a person hears when woken abruptly. What a person believes when confronted with unknown figures inside their home. Jordan posed the question that had been building since the beginning. Under those conditions, what response did the government expect? What outcome did the planners of the operation foresee? What alternative scenario did they believe was likely? And if the answer was none, then why were those conditions chosen at all? Dettelbach responded carefully, choosing each word as though it might later be replayed. He spoke about training and identification procedures. He spoke about law enforcement announcing presence. He spoke about expectations of compliance, but he could not point to footage showing any of it happened, because none existed. Jordan paused, allowing the absence to speak louder than accusation. The silence was not empty. It was filled with implication. If announcements were made, there was no record. If warnings were issued, there was no record. If restraint was exercised, there was no record. Jordan then introduced comparison, not as a rhetorical trick, but as a test of principle. He referenced another recent incident involving law enforcement and a split-second decision. In that case, footage existed. It was reviewed, debated, slowed down, dissected frame by frame. Conclusions were drawn because evidence was available. Here, Jordan noted, there was nothing to review, nothing to slow down, nothing to analyze. The very tools that allow the public to evaluate state force were absent, not by accident, but by choice. Dettelbach attempted to distinguish federal operations from local incidents. He spoke of jurisdictional differences. He spoke of operational realities. He spoke of complexities the public might not fully appreciate. But the distinction rang hollow against the simplicity of the core issue. Deadly force occurred, and the record was intentionally incomplete. Jordan's voice remained even as he returned to the timeline one final time. 57 seconds does not allow for confusion to dissipate. It does not allow for fear to be processed. It does not allow for a homeowner to verify identity in darkness. It allows only for instinct. And instinct, when confronted with force, is unpredictable. Jordan did not absolve anyone. He did not condemn anyone. He did something more damaging to institutional comfort. He described inevitability. When you combine darkness, surprise, and force, you manufacture risk. When you manufacture risk, tragedy is no longer accidental. It is foreseeable. Dettelbach shifted again, his posture no longer perfectly still. He acknowledged the loss of life. He expressed regret. He reaffirmed commitment to review. But the language felt insufficient against the specificity of the moment being dissected. Generalities struggled to survive contact with seconds and actions. Jordan let the exchange slow to a crawl. He allowed the weight of the sequence to settle over the room. No interruptions. No follow-up immediately. Just the facts, sitting where they could not be ignored. 57 seconds. Unrecorded, unreviewable, irreversible. The audience did not move. No murmurs, no reactions. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. This was the point at which the hearing crossed an invisible threshold, from inquiry into reckoning. Jordan concluded the phase without a declaration. He did not say the government had acted wrongly. He said the government had acted without leaving a trace. And in a system built on accountability, that absence was not neutral. It was a choice with consequences. As the questioning paused, the implication lingered heavier than any accusation. A life had ended in less than a minute. The conditions that led to it were planned. The evidence that could explain it was removed, and the nation was being asked to wait patiently for answers that might never come. The final phase did not arrive with a gavel strike or a raised voice. It arrived with exhaustion, the kind that settles in after every avenue of escape has been sealed and only first principles remain. Jordan no longer needed to press for facts, because the facts were already immovable. What remained was meaning, and meaning is always more dangerous than data. The question was no longer what happened, but what it said about the system that allowed it to happen this way. Jordan shifted from the specifics of the raid to the architecture behind it. He spoke about power as something that reveals itself most clearly when it operates without witnesses. He spoke about institutions that insist on trust while systematically removing verification. He spoke about how accountability is not a courtesy granted by the state, but a requirement imposed by the public. And he made clear that no investigation, however independent, could restore trust once transparency had been preemptively disabled. Dettelbach attempted to respond on institutional terms. He emphasized process, review, and future reforms. He referenced commitments to policy updates and improved implementation. He spoke as if the problem were procedural and the solution administrative. But the room understood that the wound being exposed was not a clerical error. Jordan reminded the committee that government power is at its most legitimate when it accepts constraint. Warrants authorize entry, not invisibility. Authority permits force, not secrecy. Law enforcement is strengthened by sunlight, not weakened by it. When those principles are inverted, legitimacy erodes regardless of intent. He asked whether anyone would accept a private citizen disabling cameras before a deadly encounter and then asking for patience afterward. He asked whether any ordinary defendant would be granted silence in place of evidence. He asked why the standard changes when the actor is the state. He did not wait for answers, because the comparison answered itself. Equality before the law does not survive selective transparency. Dettelbach spoke of morale and fairness to agents. Jordan responded by speaking of fairness to the dead. He spoke of a wife who would never receive clarity because clarity was never preserved. He spoke of a public that would never see the full truth because the truth was never recorded. And he spoke of how silence, when backed by power, functions as a verdict without a trial. The room absorbed the shift. This was no longer about defending or condemning individual officers. It was about whether institutions were allowed to shield themselves from the same scrutiny they demanded of everyone else. It was about whether the rules were real or rhetorical. And it was about whether democracy survives when verification becomes optional. Jordan addressed the idea of weaponization directly, but without using it as a slogan. He defined it instead as a pattern, power applied in darkness. Records removed before force is used. Accountability delayed until attention fades. That pattern, he argued, corrodes trust regardless of political affiliation. Dettelbach denied any intent to obscure. Jordan did not challenge intent. He challenged outcome. A covered camera obscures regardless of motive. A disabled light obscures regardless of justification. An inactive body camera obscures regardless of budget. Jordan explained that the most dangerous precedent is not abuse, but normalization. Once the public is trained to accept lethal force without evidence, the threshold moves. Once silence is justified as prudence, it becomes policy. Once accountability is conditional, it becomes political. And once that happens, the law no longer restrains power, it follows it. Dettelbach's responses grew shorter. He returned repeatedly to future reforms. He spoke of lessons learned. He spoke of commitments to improve. But improvement does not explain the past, and reform does not resurrect trust already lost. Jordan turned outward, speaking now to the public as much as the witness. He acknowledged that investigations would conclude, reports would be written, and statements would be released. He acknowledged that time would move on, but he warned that memory would not fade so easily. Because this case was not remembered for what was proven, but for what was missing. He asked what lessons citizens were meant to learn, that compliance requires blindness, that trust requires silence, that safety requires surrendering the right to see. He rejected all three, not with anger, but with certainty. Jordan reminded the room that body cameras were not created to punish officers. They were created to protect truth. They protect citizens from abuse and officers from false accusation. They protect institutions from speculation and democracies from decay. Disabling them is not neutral. It is consequential. Dettelbach nodded as Jordan spoke, a gesture that suggested understanding but not concession. He reiterated respect for oversight. He reiterated commitment to cooperation. But the language sounded ceremonial, unable to bridge the gap between assurance and proof. The damage being described was not theoretical, it was lived. Jordan closed not with a demand, but with a moral challenge. Either transparency applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. Either lethal force is always subject to immediate scrutiny, or scrutiny becomes selective. Either the state submits to the same standards it enforces, or legitimacy collapses. There is no middle ground that survives contact with reality. The room remained quiet as the chairman yielded his time. No applause followed. No objections were raised. What lingered was not resolution, but discomfort. The kind that signals a truth has been exposed without being resolved. As the hearing moved on, the questions did not. They followed the cameras out of the room. They followed the phones back to homes. They followed viewers long after the broadcast ended. Because unanswered questions, when grounded in fact, do not disappear. A man died in 57 seconds. Those seconds were planned, not spontaneous. The darkness was chosen, not accidental. The record was removed, not lost. And the silence that followed was defended as procedure. In a democracy, procedure exists to serve justice, not replace it. Process exists to reveal truth, not postpone it. Authority exists to protect life, not to explain its loss away. When those relationships invert, citizens are right to ask why, and when answers are deferred indefinitely, suspicion is not cynicism, it is reason. Jordan did not tell the public what to think. He did not declare guilt or innocence. He laid out a sequence and asked whether it aligned with the values being claimed. He trusted the audience to recognize imbalance when they saw it. And he trusted that trust, once broken, cannot be restored by policy alone. The final question was not directed at Dettelbach. It was directed at anyone watching. Do we accept a system that asks for faith while disabling evidence? Do we accept accountability only when it is convenient? Do we accept darkness as the price of order? Or do we demand that power operate in the open, even when it is uncomfortable? There was no answer given that day. There was no resolution offered. There was only a choice presented, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. One standard, or none at all. And the future of trust hanging on which one the public chooses.